Give me just a minute to find my place here in Ephesians chapter 6. Hope you're having a good day today. This is video number 17. Yes, number 17. Just 2 more to go and we'll be through with our Ephesians study. Anyway, today we're looking at Ephesians chapter 6 verses 1 through 9. And as you know, this passage continues the house codes that started in chapter 5 and verse 22. Husband-wife relationship. Codes of domestic behavior were common among the Gentile moralists of Paul's day. Earlier, as I said, Paul spoke of husbands and wives, and in this section he speaks of children, parents, slaves, and masters. The text addresses children first because that is the subject of the traditional house codes. Here, children are told to obey their parents and to honor them. We could go to Romans chapter 1 and 2 Timothy chapter 3 and note from those passages that disobedience to parents is a symptom of the disintegration of society. So, what Paul commands children here is important. And it comes with a promise according to the Old Covenant law in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Long life in the land of Israel is a reward held out for the keeping of this divine law. Then, Paul speaks to fathers, doesn't he? He tells fathers that they are not to provoke their children to anger. It is possible for even parents, even Christian parents, to be so unreasonable in their demands on their children that the children are irritated beyond measure and wonder whether it does any good to try to please their parents and do what they say. This text also underscores, however, the importance of teaching. Christians are to be nurturers, especially in their own homes. And from this passage we learn that children have value, and that value must not be taken lightly. They are not to be ignored or merely tolerated, but cared for and instructed about life in Christ. On the other side, focus on children can become an idolatry of children or a wrongful indulging of them. What do you think about that? Now we're moving on to verses 5 through 9, and regarding these verses, we might wonder why Paul did not call for an end to slavery in the ancient world. On the one hand, the directions given to slaves removes any suggestion that this new faith upset the cultural order. Paul does not want the church to acquire the reputation of being a subversive element in society, as other texts in the New Testament will show. He does not want to encourage any activity that would malign the gospel. I think that phrase is found in Titus, where women are encouraged to submit to their husbands so that the gospel is not maligned. And this is important for Paul. He doesn't want anything to be done in the church that might malign the message of Christ. It seems then that slavery and other social issues were not the focus of early Christianity. The gospel and its description of life in Christ were. However, on the other hand, these verses are still extremely subversive, aren't they? Slave owners may have been pleased with the service they would get, but in the process they lost control. For slaves now had a higher allegiance than to their owners. Slaves no longer belonged to their owners, did not really serve them, did not merely do their will, did not seek to please them, and were no different from them. As Paul writes, they were slaves of Christ. They served him, and they did God's will. And the slave owners were to treat them, the slaves, the same way as slaves were to treat owners. To apply mutual submission to slaves and slave owners was a startling redefinition of slavery. What Paul makes plain in this passage, I think, is that we all live in, to, and for Christ in all that we do. And the message of this text surely moves beyond ancient slave-master relations and even beyond modern-day employer-employee relations. It concerns who we really are, what motivates us, whom we seek to please, and how we use power. We are called upon to relate to all people, those who might be considered lower on the totem pole and those higher in the eyes of society, as if we were relating to Christ. That's how we are charged to relate to people. But perhaps the most important application of this text is the realization that we are slaves of Christ. We belong to Him, and we serve Him. And if we take seriously that He is the origin and recipient of every act, all our work takes on meaning, and our treatment of people changes. Work will be done with care, not just to get by. People will be nurtured, not used or ignored. What we do and how we do it matters because all of life is lived in, to, and for the Lord. Finally, Paul reminds us that we Christians only have one audience, the audience always present and to whom we are accountable, God. We are not to play to a secondary audience. We are to honor God by living in truth and love. So, there is a lot to discuss and apply in this passage, isn't there? May God bless us as we try to live up to the principles and expectations in these household codes.